Hello, welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez. This is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we remember the life of Ecuadorian artist Oswaldo Guayasamin as we celebrate 100 years since his birth. We will look at his artistic legacy for Ecuadorians and for all Latin American painters. But we also want to look deeper into his desires of social justice, how he portrayed the sufferings of the indigenous people in the region, and his political views. To discuss that, we have artist Pavel Eguez, so let's take a look at this video first.
On the 100th anniversary of Oswaldo Guayasamin's birth, Ecuador and all of Latin America honor the legacy of the indigenous revolutionary artist. Guayasamin protested against discrimination, inequality, and oppression. His paintings focused on the suffering of the indigenous peoples, but were also based on topics like war, death, and colonialism. He was admired by different artists in the world, including well-known painter Pablo Picasso, who was a friend of Guayasamin's. What is the importance of his work and what is the reality of indigenous peoples nowadays? Follow our analysis.
So thank you, Pavel, for being with us. 100 years since the birth of Oswaldo Guayasamin. Why is he still relevant today?
Well, Oswaldo Guayasamin, he fills up the 20th century. He's born in 1900s and he was dead in 1994. And he constitutes the most important things that were created in this 20th century. And they mix with the culture of Latin American art that, of course, was inspired in the Mexican Revolution. In his first foreign visit, it was to the United States in 1941, and he was in touch in 1942 with the murals that were painted in Mexico. And he was there. He was in Mexico with José Clemente Orozco, who's one of the great muralists of Mexico. So maybe in that tradition, he gets incorporated and he follows track of everything that goes on in the 20th century. Both wars, World War I and World War II, atomic bomb, the Vietnam War, the military dictatorship that were bloody, the struggle for human rights. So it was part of the defense of the principles of humanity that were pivotal to Latin America. So Guayasamin, in a way, he builds this tradition. He's part of that tradition. And his work is very personal and significant that we can now enjoy.
So there were several artists at the time doing the same thing that Oswaldo was doing, painting the struggle of the people, the oppressed people in their own countries, across Latin America. But why did Guayasamin made it through to other Latin American countries and became a symbol for all Latin American nations?
Going back to what I said before, Guayasamin is not only part of this traditional artistry, but this comes from popular movements of the Mexican Revolution, struggle for lands, for the human rights. So all of his friends that were intellectual of Latin America built his way of thinking. And what he's thinking is how to develop Latin America, how to develop their identity. He was very friend of Pablo Neruda, Fidel Castro, Garcia Marquez, and they all had this same concern We are in an America that we were totally dominated by the U.S., and the U.S. saw Latin America as their backyard. So all of this intellectual leftist group that arose in many of the Latin American countries began to propose and defend postures and to resist all of these coups d'etats that happened in Latin America, from Jacobo Arbenz, later Pinochet. So all of this intellectual group covered all of the thinking, the way of thinking. And that's why he was such a strong defender of human rights. So there was art that was committed and was born from the Mexican Revolution with Orozco, Siqueira, Rivera, and many others. So, in a way, they gave identity to Latin American art, and this tradition continues up until the 21st century. I think countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, there is a great concern of young people that are coming back to the Latin American muralism. And the concerns are basically the same, because Latin America has not been able to solve their big issues that they've been carrying from the past century. We're still fighting for independence. We still have foreign interventions in Latin America. So this means that we have the same concerns of the intellect of all the people from the past century are still questioned now, because we've not been able to overcome this North American vision towards the continent that is totally diverse and incredibly rich in social life, in cultural life, in identity. We are republics that are fabulous, creative, but in a way, we're victims of this hegemony and globalization.
Guayasamin, at that time, he denounced how the indigenous people in Ecuador were being mistreated. And if we analyze that less than 100 years ago and how the situation is at the moment, how can we put these two side by side?
It's important that Guayasamin, among one of his last speeches when they inaugurated the Church of the Man, he recognizes himself as an indigenous person. He says, I am an Indian. And he says so because of the years of the Spanish colony was the frustration of thousands of indigenous colonies and their culture. And the tragedy of the indigenous people are assumed by a very strong, powerful artistic movement. This is what social realism, where there's great literature, there's great paintings. Camilo Eguez is a great artist of Ecuador. He was a teacher of Oswaldo Guayasamin. He was a director of the New School of New York for many years. So he was an Ecuadorian with an international point of view. And he was one of the creators of one of these great movements that's called social realism. So literature, painting are a way to denounce the situation of slavery, of mistreatment, of oppression, of discrimination that the indigenous movement was undergoing. I think that in the 80s, where Guayasamin was alive, I think things began to change because strong indigenous movements began to flourish. There was these confederations of the nationalities. In the 90s, we had the first members of the National Assembly, mayors, and authorities, local authorities that were of indigenous descent. And this had not happened before. So there is a participation of the indigenous movement. It was the first protests. There was an awakening of this identity. But of course, it's also very frustrated because the government of Ecuador betrayed their ideals with Lucio Gutierrez, and later in the 90s took us to the greatest crisis of the country, where in 1999 there was this economic crisis, and this is when Guayasamin died. So unfortunately he was not able to see the flourishing of these progressive governments in Latin America. He would have loved to see the first decade of the century, 21st century, and the rising of Chavez, and all of these governments that are trying to subside all of these big differences between the very poor people that are basically the indigenous, and it's an impending
topic
struggle.
That you bring up. What would have Guayasamin painted if he had been alive at this moment, and if he had lived all through those Latin American progressive governments that led up to the situation that we have now?
Yo creo que él marca muy
fuertemente
sus etapas pictóricas, ¿no? Es decir,
he marked the differences between all of the periods that he was painting. The first one, that was the road of the crying, that his concern was to testify the humiliation towards the black, towards the indigenous, and to picture a very poor country and poor communities. Ecuador used to be had a very hard situation, and we came from a frustration that was the great liberal revolution directed by General Eloy Alfaro, and was also frustrated. So the great liberal revolution was the one that allowed to have public education. He was part of, Guayasamin was part of the art school that was part of the public schools that flourished at that time. So that thanks to that, somebody that was so poor as Guayasamin, that came from indigenous backgrounds, he was the first of 10 brothers, and it would have been very hard to have an artistic formation if the art school was not public, that was created by the liberal revolution. So in a way, Guayasamin symbolizes that too. He sees that along the years of the 20th century there are great advances, but also great frustrations. His paintings are terribly tragic when he paints the mutilated people in Vietnam. He has traces in his production of the most important historical facts. The tortures happened by the dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. Those people that were tortured are still present in Guayasamin's works. I think that he would have been part of this movement that was a reivindication, fundamentally Bolivarian. He was a profoundly Bolivarian. There are lovely paintings of him with Bolivar and Manuela Sáenz. There is also a concern in his paintings to rescue these historical people. Maybe the best example is the mural that we have in the National Assembly that symbolizes the route, the passage of the path of this country. Now we have a backlash in Ecuador. So now we've added ourselves to the worst things that are happening in Latin America. And I think that Guayasamin would also be part of the resistance. He was always a voice from the artist movement that always called us to resist.
And if we also look at the artist part of him, not just the political side and the social struggle fighter in him, what can we extract from him for Ecuadorian artists and for Latin American painting as well?
I think that Guayasamin, he's like a great sponge. He was able to catch the best of his historical moment. He studies the best part of the tradition of the historical artistry. There are many references of Greco, Goya. He always followed these great artists. And I think that Picasso was the one that widened his horizon because there are fundamental changes. He makes a very expressive painting, and then he goes to the boundaries of Cubism and develops a personal way, but always linked to the historical framework. For us today, Goya is still contemporary. When you see the disasters of war, and now that I'm working on a book of this, every time I see those paintings of the tragedy, you can see the tragedy of humanity, but you can also see how many painters have been inspired by this. And there you have the traces of Picasso, of the great artists of Latin America, because Latin America has great Guayasamins in every country of South America. So it's just a matter of paying more attention and seeing the story, the history of Latin America.
What can we do to not let this legacy dissolve? It's 100 years since he was born, but we need to move on to the next 100 years. What can we do to keep him alive?
Well, we were speaking of the tradition of the artistry history, and painting has something that has something different than the other arts, which is that it doesn't become old. You'll see a painting of 500 years ago of Leonardo da Vinci, and you can still see it alive. And the oleum is thought to last for many centuries. Maybe it's the most long-standing technology. The mixture of coloring and with oils, and this is something that's been done for 600 years now. So this is the strength of paintings, that since it's present, you can see it as up to date. I think that people that go to the Church of the Man, and now and after many decades, they're going to still have the same emotion, the same feelings when faced with all of the paintings. It's the same as when you see the Guernica or the shootings of Goya. Paintings have this great virtue that never goes out of date. And Guayasamin is one of the figures that also built his works was monumental, are still monumental. And they will be for the Ecuadorian people as a great reference. And of course for Latin America, he is part of this great Latin American art tradition.
You're a painter, so you've known a lot of painters in Ecuador and around the world. How do you see the role that Guayasamin has played in them? Do you know anyone that has said to you, well, Guayasamin changed my life, or changed the way I do art, the way I paint?
I think that he changed me particularly. He changed my life because I met Guayasamin when I was 17. I studied in the arts school of the university, and I I knocked his door and I asked him if he could receive me, and I ended up collaborating with him in several murals. One of those, the one that is in the National Assembly. And I saw him in at various moments, the human aspect of him, and not only the painter. So I think that many could have this experience. He was a very important, he was somebody that impressed you, and it was incredible to see him paint. The first time I saw him paint was this artworks of the mutilated, and it was the first piece of artwork that impressed me. It's not the same just to see the painting created, but all of the theatrics, all of the spirit that goes into painting this artwork. So that's the essence that we, the painters, are. And we learn from the previous painters that inspire us. It could be Goya, Greco, Picasso. Fundamentally, I think Picasso is still the teacher of universal art. And in that tradition, I think Ecuador has a marvelous painter that could show the rest of the world.
Indeed, and that's the way we keep him alive. Thank you, Pavel, for your time.
A ustedes, gracias, muy amable.
Thank you very much.
So we've been talking to Pavel Eguez on the legacy of Oswaldo Guayasamin, not only for Ecuador, but for all Latin Americans and for the struggles of the oppressed in the region. Thank you for watching. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.